We gotta make a move! I can get him, Sarge! Suppressing fire! Suppressing fire! One man down! Easy! Covering fire! Man, hold down! Right to my right, man! One man down!
Welcome to my first video after action report for Band of Brothers, Jim Crone's groundbreaking game of World War II tactical combat, so unlike other World War II tactical games. By basing his game on actual combat accounts and real-world tactics, Jim has achieved something special. This game rewards tactical gameplay, as you'll soon see. This first after action report is about a city street firefight. What you see is a scenario card, setting out the opposing forces, a historical background, the mission, what needs to be done to win the game, the number of turns, in this case 4, plus any special scenario rules. This video walks you through a game I played against my opponent. It explains by example how some of the key game mechanics worked during our game. Okay, so these are the forces for this scenario. Take a building. The Russians have second line squads. They get 5 of these squads. I call them 4-1s, a reference to their firepower ratings in the bottom left hand corner. 4-5-2 squads, 175 MG weapons team, and 1 command point. The Russians are up against a smaller German force, but it's made up of some crack Panzer grenadiers. There are 4-6-5 squads, 187 MG weapons team, 2 decoy or conceal counters, and 1 command point. You'll see how the values on the combat counters are applied and how decoy counters and command points are used in the game. Here's the map board used for this scenario, with north towards the top. Grey buildings are stone and brown ones are wooden. The Russian attackers start first and win if there are no German units in hexes E6 and F5. As the defenders, the Germans set up first, north of these roads. At least one German unit must set up in one of these 3 hexes. So here's how I deployed my German units. My MG weapons team here, my 4 squads here, and my 2 decoy counters. I then get to place extra decoy conceal counters on all my units before my opponent sees my setup. My opponent sets up his squads and his MG weapons team. In one hex he stacks 2 squads. You can't stack more than 2 squads, 2 weapons teams, or a squad and a weapons team in a hex. Now he gets to place decoy concealment counters on his units if they deploy in terrain such as buildings or woods. Each turn begins with the operations phase, during which players alternate moving and firing their units. I call these impulses. Each player is given an operations range, a minimum and maximum number of operations his force can conduct for his impulse. When his impulse is done, the other player gets his impulse, and so on until all units have been activated. Here we go. As part of his first operations phase impulse, my opponent activates a squad in C5 and it opens fire. Off comes its decoy conceal counter. When a unit fires, it uses this firepower value on the left if the firer and the target are stationary, in this case a firepower value of 4. This number here is a range in hexes that the unit can fire at its full firepower. A unit can fire at the target up to twice its range, but does so at half its firepower rounded down. The Russian squad is firing at a target in hex E6 within its normal range, so a firepower value of 4 is applied. But the impact of that fire is degraded by terrain and concealment. In this example, the target is concealed, so -1 to the Russian squad's fire. As a target is in a stone building, there's another minus number of 2, taking the firepower down from 4 to 1. Not good, as this is now the number needed to have any effect on a 10-sided die. And the die roll is 5, so no effect. The Russian squad is marked as used. 1 operations point from the Russian player's operations range of 3 to 4 has been expended. Now the Russian MG weapons team opens up with a firepower value of 7 that gets degraded to a value of 4. The die roll is a 3, so the German unit suffers first level suppression and loses its decoy concealment counter. When a unit is suppressed, its morale level drops. To activate a unit, in order to move or fire it, a player needs first to do a morale check with a die roll. My opponent hasn't been doing morale checks to activate his units, as they all currently have a morale level of 10, so they would automatically pass. But if I want to move or fire my suppressed MG weapons team in my impulse or as opportunity fire, I would first have to roll a 6 or less on a 10-sided die. If I fail, my unit could do nothing and it would be marked as used. 2 more Russian squads are activated and open up on a German MG weapons team, but to no effect. As my opponent has spent 4 operations points, his impulse is over and play comes to me for my operations phase impulse. I want my units to keep their concealment and hold their fire in readiness for the Russian assault, so I opt to have them marked with opportunity fire markers, which will increase their proficient firepower. Proficient firepower is the second number in from the left. It's used when a weapons team or squad is firing on a moving enemy unit with opportunity fire. When a squad is moving, it can fire on a stationary enemy unit using proficient firepower as assault fire. With 4 of my units marked with opportunity fire, my impulse is over and play goes to my opponent. For his second impulse, he activates a squad and it fires. With a 1 on a die for the fire attack, my MG weapons team suffers another level of suppression. Now to activate it, it would have to pass a morale check with a morale level of 2. 2 Russian 5-2 squads are activated to fire on one of my concealed squads in hex F5 to no effect. My opponent activates and moves a concealed Russian squad into a wooden building in G7. His unit retains its concealment as it did not fire and did not move in open ground. My impulse now, I activate and move a concealed squad from the wooden building in E4 to the woods in E5, with my squad keeping its concealment. I mark a decoy unit with an opportunity fire marker in the hope of keeping my opponent guessing. I can end my impulse here, so I do. My opponent only activates 1 Russian squad to fire on my decoy unit, attempting to remove the concealment to reveal whether there's a real squad there. We agree that we have no intention of activating any more units, so we move on to the route phase. As none of our units are required at this point to check whether they route, we pass. None of our opposing units share the same hexes, so there's no close combat, and we pass on the Mele Phase too. Now it's the recovery phase, so units recover 1 level from suppression, game counters are removed, and the turn marker goes to turn 2. Notice though that as my MG weapons team had 2 levels of suppression, it now has 1 level of suppression for the coming turn. For his first impulse of turn 2, my opponent activates his MG weapons team and a squad, both firing on my squad in the stone building in hex F5. The MG's fire causes 1 level of suppression, and when the squad gets a 3 with its die roll, another level of suppression is inflicted. With his third activation for his impulse, my opponent has a squad open up on my already suppressed MG weapons team. The die roll is good. Now both of my units in the stone building hexes are fully suppressed. My opponent has 1 more operations point left in his current impulse. He sends a squad in to assault. As you can see from the line of sight checks, the building terrain in F6 and E5 just blocks other German units from attempting opportunity fire on a moving Russian squad. My opponent guessed right. My only options are to try and activate my fully suppressed units to use opportunity fire, but each has to pass its morale check first. My MG weapons team needs to roll a 2 or less on the die. My squad needs to roll a 1 on a die. Both fail and are marked as used. The Russian squad has spent 1 movement point and can now move into the adjacent building hex for 2 movement points for a total of 3 movement points. Squads have a total of 5 movement points. Weapons teams get 4 movement points. As much as I might like my other squads to open up on hex E6, they can't, as they know friendlies are in there. There's no firing on hexes that contain your infantry or your gun units and enemy units, for good reason. Equally, if you have a squad or weapons team in a hex with enemy units, your units can't fire out of that hex. They're too closely engaged with the enemy to be firing elsewhere. Now it's my impulse. I've got to drive the Russian squad out of the stone building, so it's time to counterattack. I want to move a squad from the woods in E5 into the building in E6, but my opponent may conduct opportunity fire on my unit in its starting hex. if the first hex to be entered contains one of his units. So he tries for opportunity fire with 2 Russian 4-1 squads. No morale checks are needed as they're on a morale level of 10, but you'll see that their proficient firepower is just 1, a measure of their poor quality. This is the firepower value they have to use for opportunity fire. It's not much use unless the enemy is moving in the open, when the effective firepower is upgraded. As the terrain benefit of the woods degrades their firepower by -1, they're down to 0. But there's a rule that if a 1 is rolled on the die, there's always at least a suppression result. Both opportunity fire attacks fail to get a result. I'll mark 2 of my units with opportunity fire markers and end my impulse having spent 3 operations points. My opponent's impulse. 2 of his squads fire on what appear to be concealed units, trying to strip away the concealment to see if they are real units or fake ones. Both attempts fail to get a result. The longer my units can cling to concealment, the longer I can keep him guessing. Now he activates a squad to move it. I expect he's trying to reinforce his foothold in a stone building. When the Russian squad enters a wooden building in D7 for 2 movement points, I have my squad in D2 drop concealment and open up with opportunity fire. My Panzer Grenadier squad has a decent proficient firepower of 5, again a measure of a good unit, at just 1 less than its regular firepower. As my squad is already marked by an opportunity fire marker, I get to raise the proficient firepower value by 1, so it goes from 5 to 6. A squad or weapons team's proficient firepower can also be raised by 1 if the target is adjacent or if the player gives the unit a command point. These 3 factors, an opportunity fire marker, an adjacent target and a command point, can all be applied at the same time. But a unit's proficient firepower can't be increased by more than its regular firepower by only using these factors. Now in this situation, the wooden building degrades the firepower, so it goes down by 1 from 6 to 5. The result is 10, higher than the adjusted firepower, so no effect. In fact, on a die roll of 10, there's always no effect, no matter what the firepower value. For 3 more movement points, the Russian squad bursts into the stone building hex to join in a close combat that will get resolved later in the turn. Finally, for this impulse, my opponent moves a squad across to join his MG weapons team. On arrival, he has his squad use its proficient firepower as assault fire, hoping for a 1 on a die, but gets no result. On my last impulse of the turn, I send in a concealed squad into the stone building in hex F5. Normally, my squad would lose its concealment if it became adjacent to an enemy unit, but in this situation, the Russian squads in hex E6 are so preoccupied with the Germans in the same hex that they're not checking out the concealed German troops next door. With the operations phase done, we come to the rout phase. Units may rout if they are in one of 3 situations. 1, if they are in the same hex as an enemy unit. 2, if they are adjacent to an enemy unit that's not in melee, and 3, if they're in open ground and within 5 hexes and line of sight of an enemy unit that's not in melee. The attacker checks first. At this point, all the units in hex E6 would have to take a morale check, but if they have a morale level of 10 they pass automatically, so only the German MG weapons team must check for morale. The die roll is an 8, so it fails. Here's where I opted to use my side's command point. Command points abstractly represent command and control. If a command point is played on a unit, that unit can reroll its morale check, conduct final opportunity fire within normal range, reroll a melee combat die roll, or increase its proficient firepower attack by 1. Here I'm using it to have my MG weapons team reroll its morale check, but the second die roll is a 9, so it must rout. This high die roll also generates another outcome. It is higher than the weapon team's second casualty rating. Casualty ratings are these 2 numbers on a full strength unit. In this situation, the weapons team suffers casualty reduction as it routs. It's flipped over. Notice that some of its values are now diminished and it now has just 1 casualty rating. Now we come to the melee phase. Each unit in the same hex as an enemy unit is locked in close combat. Each squad or weapons team rolls 2 10-sided die. For each result less than or equal to a unit's firepower, 1 enemy unit in that hex is reduced. Note that weapons teams use a subscript number for their melee firepower. In Hex E6, the two Russian units managed to each get one die roll below their firepower values, so the German squad is first reduced and then reduced so it's eliminated, but my guys go down fighting. The squad's two melee die rolls are each 6, so causing a reduction and elimination of one Russian squad. My opponent gets to pick which of his two squads die. The recovery phase at the end of turn 2. My opponent has taken hold of one stone building and my MG weapons team is reduced and suppressed. One of my squads in the other part of the stone building is also suppressed. It's not looking good for the Germans.